My fellow Americans, today I speak to a nation in grief. Yesterday, a school filled with innocent children and caring teachers became the scene of terrible violence, hatred, and evil.
Welcome to Arise America. I'm Andrew Schmertz. President Trump expressing the grief of a country asking how and why after a teenager opened fire on his former classmates and teachers in Florida. The facts themselves are painful. 17 dead, and that death toll could rise with 14 injured. Authorities and classmates revealing they knew of the troubled background of the 19-year-old shooter. Arise News correspondent Akasa Oemdlapu has the latest. Akasa.
After the worst school shooting since Sandy Hook, this Florida community is trying to make sense of how it happened. Broward County Sheriff Scott Israel.
Today's not any easier than yesterday was.
19-year-old shooting suspect Nicholas Cruz was arraigned on 17 counts of premeditated murder and ordered to be held in jail without bail. The teenager's past also coming to light. His Instagram account full of images of guns. But an attorney for the family he was living with says they didn't see it coming.
The social media post. When you said
See, I don't know about that. I haven't seen it, and the family wasn't aware of it. The family wasn't aware of it. And no clue that this kid was dangerous. Okay, he had a firearm, and it was apparently locked in a cabinet here in the residence. And we just don't know what happened. With
outrage and anguish still palpable, some students, like high school senior David Hogg, are still demanding action.
This is not acceptable. This is something that is completely unacceptable and that we need to take action on.
During the shooting, students hid frantically, hoping they wouldn't be next. In this video, you can hear students whispering to each other while the shooter was in the hallway. Students describe the chaotic scene as they tried to escape.
I start going with them. I follow the herd, and it turns out that we were actually running towards the school shooter. And thank God for a janitor stopping us right before we got anywhere near close to the freshman building. He stopped us, and he got us into Chef Kurth with Chef Kurth's help into her classroom. I would say about 30 to 40 students into this teacher's classroom at the same time. And as a result of their heroic actions, they saved probably all of our lives, about 40 of us.
This community is hurting right now. There's going to be a lot of conversations over the next couple of days and weeks, and I'm going to be very animated about what I think this country can do to possibly prevent these tragedies in the future.
Community members are coming together to remember the lives lost and to begin to heal. Andrew?
Because we know that the shooter is still alive and in custody. What more are we learning about him?
We're learning that while he was living with his family friends, the family thought he was doing much better. As you know, the alleged shooter, Nicholas Cruz, the father passed away 6 years ago. The mother died last November, and he'd been battling depression. The family thought he was doing better by being in a GED program, but in fact, he was not doing better. And on the day of the shooting, he refused to go to school, saying he doesn't go to school on Valentine's Day.
And as often is the case in these incidences, we are seeing that we missed clues here, and there are some coming out now.
There are significant clues coming out. The FBI was made aware of Nicholas Cruz a year ago, and they didn't act. Also, he was expelled from school, and that was also a signal as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Akasa.
Thank you.
In his address to the nation, President Trump promised to tackle the difficult issue of mental health, but avoided any mention of guns. One high school senior who was in the previous story we just aired looked directly into the camera and pleaded with the president and lawmakers to take action. Now the question is, will they? Let's turn to our chief Washington correspondent, Eric Ham, for the latest. Eric, what is the latest from the president and what's next for him?
Well, as a local community in Florida grieves, the president took to the podium today to try to bring an entire nation together. Let's take a look at what he said.
Take your ID. Take it with you.
Do we have that sound from the
to a
president?
nation in grief. Yesterday, a school filled with innocent children and caring teachers became the scene of terrible violence, hatred, and evil. Each person who was stolen from us yesterday had a full life ahead of them, a life filled with wondrous beauty and unlimited potential and promise. Each one had dreams to pursue, love to give, and talents to share with the world. And each one had a family to whom they meant everything in the world. Today we mourn for all of those who lost their lives. We comfort the grieving and the wounded. And we hurt for the entire community of Parkland, Florida, that is now in shock and pain and searching for answers. To law enforcement, first responders, and teachers who responded so bravely in the face of danger, we thank you for your courage.
So that's what the president said today. Andrew, back to you.
He wasn't the only one in the administration speaking, of course. The nation's top law enforcement official, the Attorney General Jeff Sessions, also spoke. What did he have to say, Eric?
That's right. We saw a number of lawmakers from Washington speaking today. The president and, of course, the top law enforcement agent, Jeff Sessions, also spoke out about this issue. Let's also listen to his comments before the Sheriff's Association.
It cannot be denied that something dangerous and unhealthy is happening in our country, and we are once again watching the images of children terrified, streaming out of their school, hands over their heads. It's an image we don't need to continue to see. When parents once again go to sleep in fearful that their kids will not be safe even when they go to school, parents have told me in a gang-infested neighborhood that children can no longer stand on the bus stop by themselves. They take turns, parents do, of being out there every morning and afternoon. So we've got to confront the problem. There's no doubt about it.
Andrew, I should point out also that during the president's comments, he actually mentioned that he would be making his way down to Florida to actually meet with the families and meet with the community directly. So we do know that is something that the president will be looking to do in wake of this massive shooting that took place. And also, of course, the Attorney General is also going to be working and looking for avenues in which to curb much of the violence that we've seen take place over these last few months with the various shootings that have taken place.
Eric, the president spoke of mental illness, but back in February of 2017, he signed a bill into law rolling back President Obama's regulation and made it harder for people with mental illness to purchase a gun. Do we know if he intends to address this action now?
Well, actually, what he has done is he has mentioned this issue of mental illness, and it's surprising that there hasn't been much blowback on the president, because we remember back in this time last year, he actually rolled back the Obama regulation that made it more difficult for people with mental illness to actually get a hold of guns. And in fact, that was done in the wake of the Sandy Hook shooting. And so now the president specifically has said that he wants to address this issue of mental illness. So I don't know if that means he's actually going to tackle his own regulation that he actually put in place. And of course, there was a lot of congratulatory hand-holding by members of the NRA because the president rolled back this very issue.
And you mentioned the NRA. Inevitably, this always, of course, turns to the issue of gun control. Do we know if any of the lawmakers have mentioned this today?
There were members of the House who actually went to the floor and spoke out on the issue, and of course, Senator Chris Smith from Connecticut. Remember, Connecticut is the state where we saw that massive shooting of all those young children in Sandy Hook that took place, and he spoke out on the issue. But again, not any of the leaders actually took to actually address the issue. Again, I think, and of course, Marco Rubio, one of the largest beneficiaries of NRA money, actually said that he just didn't think this was the right time to be addressing this issue.
And Connecticut, by the way, is also the home of one of the gun industry's leading advocacy groups. We know the NRA has been very active politically, and especially in this last election cycle. They've been handing out a lot of the money to lawmakers, and that's putting the lawmakers in a little bit of they're kind of twisting their words around to try to say something today and not maybe upset the NRA.
That's right. If you look at what took place in the last election cycle, the NRA actually doled out more than $17 million, and most of that money, in fact, the majority of it went to Republicans. And in fact, President Trump himself is the beneficiary of actually more than $20 million, which is why I think many have already rightly pointed out that it was very interesting that he didn't mention the issue of guns in his speech today. And so I think what many people are seeing is just the breadth and depth and the influence that the NRA continues to hold over members of Congress, and that's why I think you're seeing a silence and an inability of these members to actually begin to effectively address this issue.
And given those resources by the NRA and the money they spend, are we likely to see any effort in Congress to address this issue this cycle before the 2018 elections?
I think that's highly unlikely. However, I will point out that just in the 115th Congress over the last year, there have been at least 21 bills that have been introduced in both chambers that actually look to curtail gun violence and are actually seeking to tackle the issue of gun and gun safety. Now, will those bills actually go anywhere? I don't think we're going to see much movement on them, but we do see a number of members actually introducing a lot of legislation. Unfortunately, we just don't see that there's any traction that's allowing this legislation to move forward.
Okay, of course, Congress has other things on its plate. It's facing a March deadline on DACA and immigration. The Senate has begun voting. What's the latest?
That's right. In fact, and just before we came on the air, there was a vote that took place, and we've seen 3 votes today from the Senate on this issue. There was the McCain-Coons bill, and that was a bill that actually offered a pathway to citizenship to 1.8 million Dreamers, but it didn't offer any money for the wall. That bill was rejected. And then there was the Toomey Amendment offered by Republican Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania that actually cracks down on sanctuary cities that don't adhere to federal regulations. That was rejected by the Senate. And the final piece of legislation that they've taken up so far is the Gang of 20 legislation, and that was led by Republican Senator Susan Collins. And this was perhaps the legislation that was seen as the one that could actually reach 60 votes in the Senate, but that too was rejected just before we came on the air. There's one final bill that they will take a vote on, the Senate will, and that's the Grassley bill, and that bill actually mirrors all of the pillars that President Trump would like to see. The full funding for the wall, pathway to citizenship for the DACA children, and cracks down on border security and eliminates chain migration and the visa lottery. However, that bill too is expected to fail. So it looks like Congress still has its work cut out for it.
All right, Eric Ham in Washington, D.C. Thank you. Grief counselors are in place in Broward County, Florida, to help survivors deal with the shooting, but parents across the country are also talking to their children. One U.S. morning show host told her audience that as a mother of 3, she had to talk to her kids off a ledge because they were afraid to go to school. Brianne Rose is a mental health counselor, and let's start with the students who survived. They are obviously the victims as well. What are they going to go through today, tomorrow, and potentially for the rest of their lives?
The main thing that stands out to me is post-traumatic stress disorder. The fear of going to school, that's like a huge first step towards that, because you go into this environment where something really horrible and traumatic happened and people died and you're terrified. So you start having flashbacks, you may start sweating, having anxiety, and it just funnels into a whole other deal of mental health
And
issues.
how did the school address that with mental health grief counselors? How do they reach those students?
Well, I know, like for my school, they were just like, hey, if anyone feels like they want to talk, come talk to us. But I think it needs to be more aggressive. I think we counselors need to pull in students and ask very specific questions. How are you feeling? How do you feel about coming to school today? What are you thinking?
And in this day and age, it's very hard to hide this news from young children even. So children across the country, maybe even the world, have seen this. What proactively should parents be talking to them about?
Parents, kind of same as the counselors at school, go out of your way to be aggressive and ask how they're doing, where they're at. But also make sure that kids understand that people aren't bad. Bad things do happen. Sometimes people do bad things, but people are not bad. To kind of dissipate that fear of going to school. Just making sure that they're aware of life in a way, and being aware of all of these kind of cues like we talked about earlier to pay attention to within your kids.
And it's important not to downplay it, right? It's important not to just give them platitudes, you'll be okay, you're safe, all of that.
Yes, wholeheartedly. Every kid's different and every kid's in a different developmental stage, but this is reality that these things are happening, but they are preventable, and I think that's a huge point to point out. Like, this has happened, the world's not terrible, this is what we can do to move forward.
What about kids who lose their friends in these kind of incidents?
That's a whole nother kind of topic of, because it's grief. And so you go into like pure grief counseling where someone close to you is lost, and adults can't handle that, let alone kids. So I think being proactive, same kind of thing, talking to them, get them a counselor, like Google it.
The key is to keep everybody talking, right?
Yes,
Would you say?
Yes, open communication is the key to, I think, a lot of things, but especially grief, trauma, and school shootings.
And maybe the school needs to take a step back from its normal routine of regular classes and hold special sessions.
I think a blend of both is perfect. Having this time to process when it happens, so that you're not like in class breaking down or in class trying to act normal, but also having class, because you have to have class, life has to go on, but you have to address it too. So it's this really difficult balance between addressing it and continuing.
Okay, Brianna Rose, you're going to come back a little bit later in the show and talk about a totally separate topic regarding the Olympics.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
South Africa's new president-elect is urging politicians to work together to, quote, improve the lives of our people rather than grandstanding. Cyril Ramaphosa was sworn in today by the High Court's Chief Justice, saying he will work hard not to disappoint the people of South Africa.
As a servant of our people, because I do believe that when one is elected in this type of position, you basically become a servant of the people of South Africa, and I'll seek to execute that task with humility, with faithfulness, and with dignity as well. That is what I will seek to do.
Ramaphosa replaced President Zuma, who stepped down yesterday. Arise News correspondent Duarte Geraldino has the details.
Cyril Ramaphosa became the 5th president of the Republic of South Africa less than 16 hours after former President Jacob Zuma resigned. Now, moments after Ramaphosa took office, members of his party, the African National Congress, stood up and started dancing in Parliament. Their celebrations belie the struggle ahead for a political party that has held almost absolute power in South Africa since the end of apartheid. And the party itself began as a revolutionary movement. Opposition parties saw the political drama surrounding Jacob Zuma as an opportunity to take ground. Now, opposition party members vowed to come after Ramaphosa during the 2019 election. At least one suggested the real problem in South Africa was not Jacob Zuma, but rather the African National Congress itself. In 2016, the ANC suffered its worst election results since it came to power in 1994. Though still a majority, its share of the vote in local elections sank to 55%. That was a humiliating blow to former President Jacob Zuma, and in some ways, it marked the beginning of the end for a man who now faces 783 criminal charges related to corruption. So in the months leading up to the next presidential election, among President Ramaphosa's many tasks will be to the image of the African National Congress, which is the continent's oldest and most powerful political party. In Lagos, Duarte Geraldino, Arise News.
Dreamers, their futures in limbo. We'll talk with one next on Arise America. As we reported earlier, the Senate today rejecting a bipartisan deal on immigration, leaving the lives of hundreds of thousands of so-called dreamers in doubt. Denise Gonzalez is one of those dreamers. She is also a paralegal and tenant organizer with Mobilization for Justice. Also with us, Ernie Collette is a staff attorney for the organization. Ernie, I'll start with you because we have news out of the Senate. They put up several bills, all getting voted down, including the one that Eric Ham reported had the best shot at passing. Where does this all stand as of now?
Effectively, right now, where it stands is we're sort of at a restart. The Senate basically said they were trying to get the vote passed today so they can actually push this onto the House. With all these bills sort of being rejected either for on purely partisan reasons, for either it being not enough in terms of enforcement or for immigration, specifically with the 1.8 million looking as an amnesty for Republicans. Effectively what's going to happen is they're going to take a recess next week and evaluate it, but it puts a serious deadline to the date certain on March 5th.
On March 5th. Denise, you've been in this country about 16, 17 years now. You must be feeling like the train is going over the cliff.
No, absolutely. It's, I think, a time of uncertainty for anyone who's a DACA recipient or TPS for that matter. But I think that when it comes to DACA, which is what affects me personally, you know, I'm standing to lose a lot from everything from my position at the organization that I currently work at to, you know, being dropped from my college because undocumented students in New York can't afford, don't receive financial aid, which means that we pay tuition out of pocket, and so without DACA, without having a feasible salary, we will not be able to actually pay for school.
Chief of Staff John Kelly said that deporting dreamers is not a top priority, but you just raised a very interesting point. You'll have no ability to earn a living because you can't work without working papers.
Exactly, and so I will be pushed back into the informal economy, which absolutely does not provide a standard of living.
How do you feel about President Trump's position, which is build a wall and he will provide a pathway to citizenship for 1.8 million people, more than the dreamers out there?
I think that it's disingenuous for politicians from both parties to attach enforcement to any bill at this point when we have had 10 years of essentially failing to pass any bipartisan bill that provides actual permanent relief for people, while we have seen, you know, administration after administration, Congress pass budget bills that include enforcement anyways. And so to say that we have to attach enforcement to these bills, I think is disingenuous, and also sort of provides a cover for, I think, what has been an exuberant amount of money being spent on enforcement for the last 10, 15 years.
And Ernie, President Obama was criticized of ramping up deportations, and that sort of got us to where we are now.
In a sense, that's correct. The prior administration, actually, President Obama has the unfortunate circumstance of being the president under watch of having the most deportations occur. But what we're seeing now with an executive order that was signed in early January of last year, we're seeing wider dragnets. We're seeing immigrants being literally ripped away from their children and their spouses and their families. People that have no criminal issues or very minor issues that have led to massive enforcement. So as opposed to what happened in the Obama administration, where they were doing higher priority for national security purposes or immigrants that have massive criminal issues or major criminal issues, we're looking at sort of a wider net being cast, and a lot of families are being torn apart as a result.
On Tuesday, a federal judge ruled the Trump administration cannot end the DACA program. First, what was the legal basis of that ruling? And do you have any sense that the administration will abide by it?
Well, the legal basis is a preliminary injunction, which effectively stipulates that the program, while it won't allow people to sign up for DACA, it'll allow individuals who will not have their DACA expire past the March 5th deadline to continue to renew. So individuals will continue to renew while the case is pending. What the Trump administration had asked for a couple of weeks ago in January, which the Supreme Court actually granted, was an opportunity to be heard, to not have the cases both in Brooklyn and in California, because there were two separate cases, actually go up to their respective circuits, the Second Circuit and the Ninth Circuit, but to actually have argument over the case in the Supreme Court. And that is actually scheduled to have an argument over the courts tomorrow. So we should find out whether or not the court will actually schedule a hearing for this.
The Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court will schedule a hearing for this in spring, or if it'll actually go back down to the circuit courts where they'll
and
determine.
the spring is a little late, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You work with Dreamers. What are you hearing from them?
Well, I think that for us, it's just increased anxiety. Many of us, especially people who have been part of the immigrant rights movement and have seen sort of the trajectory of increased enforcement, also are dealing with PTSD, mental health issues, coming out of the experiences of organizing, being activists in this issue, and having our own families be targeted for deportation. And so, I think that right now I'm working with students at Lehman College, which is where I study, to try and figure out how our administration can support us in, for example, not dropping students who can no longer pay their tuition, or even offering mental health services, financial support for students who may need it.
Under the Trump proposal, it would end what he calls chain immigration, and some see that as a very divisive term. What is your position on families bringing their family members in?
I think that we should be opening our borders as much as possible given the refugee crisis that's going on around the world. Again, I really reject any idea that immigrants are the cause of national security issues, to the extent that we're seeing violence occur and sort of be bred in home in our own country. And so, and I think that the U.S. also has a responsibility, to the extent that they're involved in many of the international crises, to also offer refuge for people who are fleeing violence, whether it be economic or military.
Ernie, do you think the part of the plan here by the president was to put the feet to the fire of Congress, and he thought maybe they'd get something done, but they're not getting anything done right now?
I mean, that's certainly one way of looking at it. Another could be a strategy in order to actually delay the opportunity for this Dreamer decision to actually be adjudicated, or to be decided by Congress. One, you can look at it from a perspective of trying to actually enforce and setting a date certain. The problem with a date certain, and as we've seen, unfortunately, with Congress, is that we sort of put ourselves right up to the last minute to actually decide these issues. And when you're having 800,000 or potentially 1.8 million people have that anxiety on the line, it could be a little bit too much. So really what should happen is that there should not have been a date certain. The DACA should have continued, and the legislation should have actually been able to do their jobs and actually pass something, hopefully a clean Dream Act, which is what the advocacy communities in New York and around the country are actually hoping to get.
Denise, are you making plans for the worst case scenario?
Yeah, I think that, ever since Obama signed DACA as an executive action, we've known that it's a temporary solution at best, since it has always been conditional and temporary, and put the onus on people to continue to renew it and make sure that they're in the circumstances to be eligible. And so I think that, we have been in limbo pretty much since the early 2000s. Yeah, and, there is an increased anxiety with this administration, given like the racial overtones of the narrative right now, but I think that for a lot of us it's familiar, it's a little bit more intense, and we're definitely using it as an opportunity to reflect on the last 10 years of the immigrant rights movement, when both parties have sort of failed to pass something substantive for us.
Okay, Denise Gonzalez, Ernie Collette, keep us posted, please.
Thank you very much.
Come back.
Thank you for having us.
Coming up next, where the jobs are, the latest business news. You're watching Arise America. Time now for a look at business news. The market's made a run at a 5-day winning streak and they pulled it off. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 306 points. That's better than 1%. To 25,200, the S&P 500, the NASDAQ also up better than 1.5 each. Inflation jumped more than expected thanks to a rising gas and healthcare costs. The Labor Department says the Producer Price Index rose 0.4% in January and 2.5% for the past 12 months. The PPI measures inflation at the wholesale level. It's another sign of rising prices. Tech investor and Donald Trump supporter Peter Thiel may soon be out of Silicon Valley. Reports say the libertarian-leaning conservative plans to move from San Francisco to Los Angeles and may eventually leave the board of Facebook. He has criticized Facebook for what he says is political bias in its newsfeed. Thiel has served as an unofficial advisor to President Trump since the election. Fresh off his SpaceX victory, Elon Musk is closer to providing his dream of space-based internet service. FCC Chairman Ajit Pai has endorsed Musk's application to provide satellite internet service. In an application to the FCC last year, SpaceX proposed launching 4,200 satellites to provide broadband service at fiber optic speeds that could benefit rural areas that do not have cable-based internet service. AT&T may deploy an unusual strategy in its battle with the Justice Department over its desire to buy Time Warner. The Wall Street Journal reporting that AT&T may ask the top antitrust lawyer at the DOJ to testify at the upcoming trial. The antitrust chief at the DOJ has recommended the deal be blocked. AT&T argues it's being stopped for political reasons. The Trump administration says the deal is bad for consumers. AT&T has proposed an $85 billion merger with Time Warner. And if you're looking for a job, you may want to try one of these. There apparently is a shortage of qualified workers in these industries. The website careercast.com says the following jobs are in demand: application software developer, construction worker, personal health care aides, and truck drivers. I can't do any of those jobs, so I'm here. Now to a story trending on social media. Olympic gymnast Aly Raisman explaining why she posed nude for Sports Illustrated. The feature is called In Her Own Words, and one photo shows Raisman with nothing but words scrawled across her body. The 23-year-old is one of more than 100 women who say that Dr. Larry Nassar sexually abused them with the photos. Raisman is drawing both cheers and jeers. Joining us once again now to discuss them and the implied meaning is Brianne Rose, a mental health counselor who specializes in sexual abuse. What do you think about this, that she is posing nude to sort of counter what's been out there, if that's what she's doing?
If that's what she's doing, I think it's amazing and like a perfect opportunity to kind of reclaim her body after it not being hers because of what she and the others went through with Nassar and what so many other people go through with sexual assault. So I love it.
So you think it's a positive way for her to heal?
I think it's positive. So I think healing is so individualized.
Yeah.
I don't want to like put words in her mouth, but I think if it's something she feels comfortable with, which if she's in Sports Illustrated, we can assume that it's very positive. And I think that it could be positive for other men and women too, to kind of put themselves out there vulnerable.
Some could say that it's exploitative, though, right? And that unknowingly on her part, she could maybe be hurting victims of Nassar more.
True. And if that's the case, I think it's important for these survivors, I'm going to reframe that victim's word to survivors, to think about what about her showing her body is hurting them, what it brings up for them, and that can be addressed within themselves to kind of promote that healing process. But the intent does not seem exploitive.
And it was done in a, some would say, in a classy way.
Yes.
Because she had specific words: survivors, fierce, women, every voice matters on her on the photo.
These power words on her body, which was previously vulnerable and taken advantage of.
So it depends on how she's going through her own personal healing, right? Would you say, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if that's all she's doing, that's not going to help her, that maybe she needs to personally do more therapy?
For sure. I think that healing from something as traumatic as what they all went through is a process. It takes time, and taking pictures is a step in that long journey of healing.
And it's about what we talked about before, talking about it.
Yeah.
And speaking of talking about it, did you find the testimony of all the victims at the trials, is that helpful to an individual?
I think it could be helpful for them who are speaking and for others hearing them. Just putting out what really happened, the raw emotion, addressing a conversation about like sexual assault, rape, all these things that's really hard to talk about.
Let me ask you this. Most victims of sexual abuse have neither of those opportunities, either to speak to the victims, their abusers in court, or to pose in a national publication or media. So what do they do?
And we talked about this before on here. I think that the key is to talk to someone. Even if it starts with yourself and you're just like writing down things or in your room processing out loud, processing internally. Have the conversation with yourself or with someone who really unconditionally loves you and is willing to hear you out. But the fact that they were able to get it out in front of him, in front of the world, is powerful.
For them it is. For somebody else, they may have to find other means to get through this.
They might have to get more creative. These girls were in a different position than some others.
Okay, Brianne Rose, thank you for both segments today.
Yeah,
good job.
Thank you.
Come back soon. If you are still savoring the taste of that Valentine's Day chocolate, stick around. We'll introduce you to one very interesting chocolate made in the Bronx. Next on Arise America. Three brothers in the Bronx, New York, are taking a bite out of America's $7 billion appetite for chocolate with a simple recipe and organic ingredients. They're putting the soul back into chocolate, one bar at a time. Chocolate maker Daniel Maloney is co-owner of Soul Cacao, and he joins us now. Welcome.
Welcome, thank you.
Let's start with the holiday that just passed, Valentine's Day. How big of a holiday is that, and do you rely too much on it?
So chocolate, roughly, most chocolate companies, they, revenue roughly 40% of all annual sales along the holidays. Valentine's Day, Christmas, Easter, just to list off a few. And I would say Valentine's Day went pretty wonderful for us.
Okay, that's great. Your chocolate, you say the chocolate is two simple ingredients. What are they?
So to make our chocolates, we make bean-to-bar chocolate. So what we do is we bring up bean-to-bar.
Okay.
So we bring up organic cacao from single estates or like a cooperative to our chocolate factory.
Where's chocolate made these days?
Or
grown?
Chocolate are grown, 20 degrees north and south of the equator. So anywhere along that belt, chocolate could grow. You're talking Indonesia.
That's like the chocolate belt.
That's the chocolate belt, so to say. And that's why it's a commodity, because it grows in that limited region. So in short, we only use two ingredients, which is organic cacao.
Now you can hold those up, by the way.
So this is one of our bar, Peru. So two ingredients, organic cacao, and then we only use a little bit of organic cane sugar, and that's all you need to make a single estate bar.
Do you go through many recipes and taste many chocolates to come up with it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the idea came into our minds roughly at the winter of 2011, and we've been working on it since. We produced our first bar March 2015, and since then we've been up and running.
You grew up in Trinidad and Tobago. How did you end up in the chocolate business?
So Trinidad has a 400-year history of producing some of the finest cacao in the world, and growing up in a culture that drank cacao, ate it. That's really kind of it was the #1 GDP creator in Trinidad in the early 1900s. So after reading a lot of factual historic literature, that's kind of gave us the firepower to say, you know what, we want to dive into chocolate and celebrate that with the world.
Chocolate's making a health comeback in a way, because there's all sorts of stories about dark chocolate, this chocolate, that chocolate is actually good for you.
That's right.
And that's got to be a good feeling.
Oh yeah, so there's a lot of scientific research being published talking about the benefits of eating dark chocolate for your skin. It has a lot of antioxidants, polyphenol to name one, which is great for combating anti-aging properties, has a lot of that. And it's also good for your skin, your heart health, and your brain health.
Now I'm generally the business reporter, so I'll have to ask you a business question.
Sure.
We are facing a chocolate shortage.
That's right.
Which could be devastating, especially if you're a fan of chocolate and like to eat a lot of it.
Absolutely.
What's going on?
We're seeing that right now. Climate change is playing a large factor into that. A lot of people who didn't, provide shade for their cacao plantations, you will see a drop in, production. But then you also have rising demand in China and India. These are countries with population over 1 billion, and as they, continue to increase their consumption of chocolate, that's really going to...
You were saying they eat 1 bar a day, and that could go to 2 or 3.
Exactly.
So that could triple.
That could triple. So, then...
Is that a change in demographics and perception of chocolate, or access?
Absolutely. So it's access of chocolate. It's also, just the increase in, expendable income. in these countries. So they're going to be looking for, items that goes beyond the dollar value. So more something experiential, such as a dark chocolate bar or a luxury item, and that's what we're creating.
How do you distribute the chocolate? Because I interviewed somebody who went into the beer business, and they said they're really in the trucking business, and I imagine it's not entirely different in the chocolate business.
It's not that different. So we, distribute to Whole Foods, where you could find us in all Whole Foods in New York City. We're also in a lot of specialty shops in China, Live Till This One in California. We're in Colorado. You could find us in Portland. So, word of mouth, just through, telling the story. A lot of people tend to reach out and they want to support. So,
what's your best seller?
I think our best seller is our Madagascar bar. And, this was the first bar we came out with. It's very fruity notes, similar to, you get a lot of raisiny characters. You get some dark cherry as well. And
is it like a little bit like the wine business, where you get different flavors the way you make it?
Yeah, so chocolate is, has a lot of vintage properties. So year to year, the chocolate tastes differently based on the rain and the sunshine. So we try to, kind of bring out the essence of those seasons in our chocolate making process.
What other big holidays are there, and how do you expand the use and purchase of chocolate?
I think, it's more so, how can you use chocolate? I think, you could crumble it over a yogurt. You could even put cacao nibs over a salad just for like a crunchy factor. So I think it's more, on one end, really kind of showing people how real chocolate tasted back in the day by only using 2 ingredients. And then the other avenue is obviously coming up with creative ways like brownies and cookies. And
Daniel
so
Maloney, thank you.
Thank you.
I hope I get to taste some.
Yes, yes.
And that's it for Arise America in New York. I'm Andrew Schmertz. We'll see you tomorrow.